One of my favourite biblical stories is the story of Martha and Mary. Martha and Mary are two sisters. Their brother is and was Lazarus. Lazarus, of course, is the friend of Jesus who Jesus asked to rise from the dead and come out of the cave, which Lazarus then did. It's a metaphor for being lifted up, for being renewed, refreshed, called back to life through coming to the understanding of absolute, the absolute, or love with a capital L, or God. Martha and Mary in this story have invited Jesus round for supper. Jesus comes round and Martha is busying herself chopping, boiling, cooking, running water in the kitchen, whilst Mary is seen seated at the feet of Jesus and is simply listening to him talk and being with him. They are, of course, metaphors for what we know as being, or if we introvert and inquire enough into our interiority, we come to a place of ever-present beingness, what we might call the space in which the I thought arises. Whereas the world in which we inhabit is frequently and largely a world of much doing. And human beings, of course, spend much of our time trying to attain experiences of being by ticking off our list of things to do, all the activities with which we have charged largely ourselves to continue to do until we can experience happiness. We live in the West, we live in a culture where we have annual leave and holidays from the workplace in order to find that kind of rest. Yet the interior journey, the life in which we are asked larger questions about our experiences and meaning, and in our search for happiness, often many of us begin to move inwardly. We might use substances, we might use religion, we might use things to begin that path. And in Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy or perennial tradition, we find that at their more mature levels, the use of progressive paths, tools and practices still point to the same place. There is now a way of expressing this more directly, which has been reimagined through practices of what we now call mindfulness, what was once called, and still called meditation, what we once called attachments, either attachment theory or the attachment of Buddhism. And if we went far enough back into literature and our search for meaning, we end up with the psychology as it was expressed through religious scripture. Religion, for me, is just an earlier way of describing our search for meaning, or what we would now call psychology or philosophy, as we explore bigger questions than those about our individual self. Martha and Mary, the metaphor of the story is to see those two parts of what appear as two parts of, or as a duality of the human experience. Elsewhere the Bible describes being in the world but not of the world. And to be in the world is to live out of our sense of self, our individual focus, our locus and our modus operandi. We live for a sense of self. I am this person, these are my beliefs, this is my past, there are my hopes for the future, this is my story, the narrative of me, and I have preferences. These are the things I currently like, and these of course change over time, and these are the things I hope to like or hope to secure or no longer like, and of course that changes over time as things become current or in vogue or in fashion. We develop preferences, and this constantly modulates in our search for meaning. But our sense of being a person on that search for meaning doesn't change. So this somewhat describes in loose terms to be in the world. Now the not of the world, of in the world but not of the world, is perhaps a more spiritual term, philosophical term, psychological term, even religious term, which describes that true self-sense, as Thomas Merton called it, true self-sense of my inmost being, or the space in which the I thought arises, as we said a moment ago. So we are in the world, there is a sense of my innate nature, my inherent sense of being, and the quality of beingness that stems out of that. And then there is to be in the world. So we're in the world but not of the world. So this seems to describe a duality. Now, of course, in non-dual terms, non-dual is not two. This proposes that these are not two different things. They are, in fact, one and the same. At its more mature teaching, non-duality would describe that which appears as a duality is, in fact, simply a movement of the non-dual. So we cannot separate being in the world and not of the world. They are two. Now, of course, through self-inquiry, through self-reflection, through the recognition of our true nature, and through the awareness of the self, this imagined separate or egoic self, and our true self-situ that we've never once left and never could leave, this experience of this beautiful, complex, difficult and profound creation called life. We know both our own being, and we know both experiences and preferences that we've alluded to. We cannot separate these two things. We cannot meditate ourselves into a state of not being in the world. Arguably, once the body dissipates and the body comes to the end of its pattern and its process, philosophies and religions tend to suggest that there's something else, but ultimately we can only speculate on that. Death, as I've said elsewhere, and being dead is something known only by the living. We don't know what the dead know, if we're honest with ourselves about that. We do know that the dead probably can't spell dead or death, or know nothing of it. Perhaps if we're being more optimistic than as pessimistic as that sounds, then we could speculate that there may be something with which to look forward to, that there may be life, and perhaps this is a dream and this is death. But we don't really know. We just have sometimes some pretty compelling pointers, and sometimes we've misinterpreted the messages that speak to that. And this story of Martha and Mary does point to Huxley's perennial philosophy or perennial tradition. And in that perennial tradition, it describes that great truth or absolute truth appears on every continent and every time frame and every culture and every tribe. So absolute truth appears out of each group and tribes and communities and time and place in history's attempts to understand what it's experiencing. One way in which Martha and Mary can be seen elsewhere is in the Bhagavad Gita story of Krishna and Arjuna. Krishna, of course, is similar, I'm going to say that, similar to the Christ character, at least in the story, in the narrative, in that it's a representation of the personification of the absolute Godhead, or the face of reality of the world that we know, that is the face of God as we might understand that word, or absolute love, love with a capital L, or bigger mind, or a bigger story, a bigger picture than my little story, or my life, or my things, or my possessions, or my birth, my death. But not our story, or our life, or our death, but the story, the absolute story, the universal story, the absolute story. And Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is the humanness, the imagined false self, we might say, if we use those words. In such, Arjuna is battling with himself. He's in a dilemma, he's sweating, he's worried, he's a princely character of a respected family, and they're warring with another family, and they're due to go into battle, and Krishna and Arjuna are situated in the chariot. In philosophical terms, again, we have similar characters to Martha and Mary. They are the true self and the sense for self. Now, of course, the mental narrative of Arjuna is that he's in a dilemma, he's expressing fear, he's expressing concern, he's expressing worry, he's talking in terms of consequences, he's traumatized, he's having a really difficult time of it, and in expressing that, his sense of his inmost being, of Krishna in the story, he's waiting for answers, he's listening, he's talking and he's listening, he's talking and he's listening, or he's doing and he's being, he's doing and he's being, or he's in the world but he's not of the world. Just as Martha is in the world, overwhelmed by the tasks of the kitchen in order to find happiness. As Mary is not of the world. She already knows happiness. She has awoken to happiness and she is seated at its feet. So here we have just a pointer to some interesting texts and scriptures. And once more, Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. It's a great book. You can find it in downloadable format on the internet, or you can do the man a solid and go out and buy a copy. It's a really interesting read because it really demystifies the mystical. And of course, Huxley was a wonderful author, philosopher and academic, and just a brilliant mind, really. So there's 3 recommendations there: the Bhagavad Gita, the Judeo-Christian Bible from a non-dual, or we might say mystical perspective, and Aldous Huxley's Perennial Tradition. Perhaps this has been helpful, but for now, I am empty.